Dorian Gray was set during the Victorian era. The name of this era comes from Queen Victoria, who reigned from 1837 to 1901. It was a conservative time period, filled with strict, unspoken societal rules. There was a strong drive by many churches for stricter moral standards, and these moralistic values were imposed on society. As a result, many members of society were fussy, overbearing, and self-righteous, but also extremely hypocritical. In this novel, the Victorian class system is reflected as we see the separation of the aristocrats and the middle or lower class. The majority of characters that we meet in the novel belong to the wealthy upper class. The wealthy led indolent and sedentary lives. That meant they were lazy and self-indulgent. They filled their time with socializing and entertainment and very little work. A lot of time was spent amusing themselves with scandal and gossip amongst their friends. They cared very much about appearances and tried to hide anything that was considered ugly, unsavory, or unacceptable in society. It's also important to note that at this time, the Industrial Revolution had just taken place. The Industrial Revolution was basically the mass production of cheap products. It was driven by consumerism, and because of the mass production, where identical products were just churned out of a factory, one after the other, it was characterized by repetitive designs and a lack of individuality. Art during the Victorian era had to have a purpose. It could have a socio-economic meaning that was being shown, or it could reflect the artist's thoughts or feelings. Whatever the purpose, it was always realistic and had a reason for existing. That leads us to the second concept, the aesthetic movement. The catchphrase for the aesthetic movement was art for art's sake. Just imagine if I asked if any of you were planning to get a tattoo one day. Maybe someone wants the word mom tattooed on their bicep because that's the person that they love the most. Or maybe a Protea because of the love you have for South Africa. But there may be some of you who want a tattoo of something for no specific reason. It doesn't mean anything. It just looks nice. That is basically the concept of art for art's sake. Now, the aesthetic movement was a reaction to the things we've already spoken about. It reacted to the Industrial Revolution as it was breaking away from the ugly repetition of mass consumerism. And it viewed art in a very different way to how it had been viewed up until then. And so it was considered anti-Victorian. It no longer aimed to be realistic. It didn't want to replicate the world because the world is ugly. Instead, it aimed to escape from it. Art didn't need a reason to exist. Its beauty was justification enough. Now, this focus on sensual pleasure brings us to the third concept, hedonism. Hedonism is the pursuit of pleasure, absolute sensual self-indulgence. Please note that I'm saying sensual and not sexual. Although they can mean the same thing, sensual just means appealing to the senses. So for the upper class, Victorian Society, it meant luxurious food, or wine, or listening to the opera, anything that appeals to the bodily senses. And hedonism is the pursuit of these pleasures above all else. The belief that this is the most important thing an individual can achieve. The idea that you should try everything and regret nothing. Basically, if YOLO had been around back then, it would have been the hedonist's motto. And so we see Dorian sneaking to an opium den where he can indulge his senses with drugs and alcohol. These are sordid places that show the ugly side of society, as well as their corruption and duplicity. Of course, Dorian doesn't use his real name because he wants to remain anonymous and retain his good reputation in society. Which brings us back to the beginning, the Victorian Society, and how hypocritical they are.